Bonjour. Wache, Sego, Sugoli, and good morning. First of all, I want to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the other Indigenous nations that would enter this territory over time based on our original treaties and protocols among our nations, those being the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and others that would come here in the spirit and intent of our original treaties. I want to also thank the organizers for allowing me an opportunity to speak at this summit, a very kind invitation to share some thoughts this morning. I've been asked to speak on social license and how industry must work in partnership with First Nation communities so that everyone benefits. Specifically on how it is that First Nations may become the energy suppliers as a result of value added in project development. But first, I would be remiss in not referencing this past Monday's federal election. As you all know, Canada has a new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And although we may have a different shade of hair and a different style, we share some of the same expectations and political ideas. Mr. Trudeau and his Liberal Party are riding in on the magic carpet of a majority government with high expectations from all Canadians and a serious agenda from First Nations in this country. We have endured a decade of neglect and flat-out institutional racial discrimination under the Conservative regime. And I must make that note because I think that sets out the starting point in terms of the work that industry and First Nations are having to do on some of the major projects where it pertains to the federal government and the federal government investment. Now allow me just to vent for about 20 seconds, and I promise I won't do it after that. In recent years, approximately $1 billion in critical social service funding has been held back from First Nations by this federal government, and I say that with all my facts in place. You just look in the media, and if you do your research, you will note that about 4 months ago, our First Nations had looked deeper into how the federal government was shifting around and reprofiling, repurposing the funding envelope, and surprisingly, there was over $1 billion missing from what should have went to First Nations over the last 3 to 5 years. This is larceny and political lunacy in its most blatant form. Think about it for a second. If Mr. Harper would have squandered and hid over $1 billion in health funding or tax surplus or subsidy potentials for, say, the manufacturing industry, essentially this is taking mouths from Canadians, taking food from the mouths of Canadians, right? Well, folks, that's in fact what happened to First Nations. Thinking that a surplus on the backs of First Nations would have bought him a new mandate. The only date that had got him was a moving date from 24 Sussex. And First Nations are quite pleased about that, I'll tell you. And I say that, and the last part of my rant is that when we examine the appetite for the government at the federal level, First Nations, clearly 99% of our people did not want to deal with the Conservative government again. That really leaves an interpretation of some pretty strong messaging. But you know, we do wish wellness for Mr. Harper and his family. Humanity should always be our focus. And yesterday, we saw in the media Mr. Harper and Mr. Trudeau laying a wreath together for the family and for the fallen soldier in Ottawa. So we know that overall this is about humanity. Mr. Trudeau has pledged to repair and restore the nation-to-nation relationship between First Nations and Canada. His new Liberal government will establish a much-needed inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country. Mr. Trudeau has also pledged to invest in badly needed critical infrastructure. This includes endless decades of boil water advisories. And again, just so that industry folks know here, one of the things that we had to do in this election was we had to pay special attention to the commitments and the types of investment levels that were put out there. And I'll just have you just think about this for a second. When First Nations have, under various line ministries, and in this case, the Aboriginal and Northern Affairs Canada, there's a set amount that's put in place, and oftentimes we have to be very careful that those aren't reprofiled dollars or they're existing in envelopes or just renamed something else. We were very concerned that, yes, this government came in like every other government in their campaigns saying, yes, this is how much money we're going to spend. We need new investment in the North. Many of our communities need to know that a government is actually going to deal with the issues. So what I did was I had various meetings with Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Mulcair, and I indicated that, let's end boil water advisories in First Nations within 5 years. And that gave us a time sequence to actually deal with it, and whatever the cost would be really remained up to the Liberal government. And it took a couple weeks, but the Liberal government came back. Their policy advisors said, yes, we have to address it. It's a social nightmare, and it's a human rights issue. So we now have a situation, and I think the investment community and developers need to think about this, that we're looking at anywhere from, say, 480 million to, say, 750 million over about a 3 to 5 year period on fixing up the water systems in the North. And that has a number of positive implications. Most importantly, First Nations are also in dire need of investment in housing, health, and accessible and affordable food. We need billions of dollars for education and job training, and again, this is of utmost importance to the development industry. Let me give you just one example of the overwhelming poverty and despair that our people deal with on a daily basis. And I wish I came here, giving you a message of economic prosperity and hope, and the message is there, but I think I need to put some place markers of reality in front of you that our people deal with in the North. And again, I put this picture up there because this is one of the homes in one of the First Nations that I visited in the last 3 months. But here's a story for you to think about. Keep an open mind. 6 months ago, a chief from a northern First Nation community here in Ontario told me the sad news about a 10-year-old boy who committed suicide. This child had no one who was able to properly care for him. His father was a double amputee going in and out of the hospital from the remote community to Thunder Bay and Toronto. His mother was a drug addict and on methadone treatment. His grandparents tried, but they could not care for him. The boy was a special needs child. On top of that, this boy was bullied by children in the chaos, the emotional chaos that was going on in his life. And he eventually, over a 6-month period, about 6 months ago, he felt there was no option but to take his own life. It's a 10-year-old boy. And I tell you that because this is not an isolated incident. We just had another situation in another remote community just probably less than a week ago, a 13-year-old child. And it's not uncommon in the North for these young people and our youth to take their own lives. And it's getting to the point now where as a result of the medical cuts and the deep despair that's created over the last decade, some of our seniors are now taking their lives. And many of you don't know these statistics, and Canada has not wanted to really put those statistics out in front of society because it's quite a contradiction to the lives that many of us live in the South. So there is much work to do and much work that needs to be done to begin righting all the wrongs inflicted upon our peoples over far too many decades. We now have a First Nation health crisis like no other in this country. This is a Canadian problem. And this is something that Canadians have access to every day. I will be working with the University of Toronto and a philanthropist by the name of Dr. Michael Dan. And, this individual was his father owned Triva, it's Nova Pharmaceuticals, and he gave his fortune to his 3 sons. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to invest his money, some of his money, into looking at the realities that Canadians face every day. And he clearly jumped at the opportunity to work with First Nations, and we're going to be doing some studies and getting things out in front of folks like you, the investment community, to give you a much clearer understanding of the social implications that you're going to be dealing with as you go into the north. We do expect industry to invest in our communities and partner with our peoples. If you want to share of the resources from our lands, then there is definitely a quid pro quo that must be expected as the moral underfabric of building these partnerships with First Nations. And again, we're not expecting an over and above cost of doing business here. Let me explain to you in a little bit of detail what that investment means. You have to remind government, both at the provincial and the federal level, that they have responsibilities. Otherwise, our peoples will continue to suffer and industry will continue to encounter delays. Not just delays on the ground and obtaining approvals, but delays in the field. You need to ensure that you maximize your cost impact by actually accessing your human resources in the north. And we've got really good people in the north. They just need the proper investments in employment and training. Regarding that very important point of government having their responsibilities and work to do, let me make this observation point. This would amount to outstanding liabilities. In fact, this could be the matter of outstanding obligations. So what you're actually dealing with and the challenge of obtaining a social license, there's the initial outset issue of outstanding obligations with the government. And I'm happy to say that this government has indicated, let's work on a nation-to-nation relationship. When I met with Justin Trudeau in July, he committed to addressing the matter of unfinished treaty business with First Nations. That is the underlying starting point that industry bears going in. Governments now realize this, and so too should industry. Governments must do their part, including First Nation governments. So I just want to underscore there that possibly part of the obtaining of a social license is industry recognizing the importance of having an initial dialogue. In mainstream community, you wouldn't have to do that, but in First Nation communities, I think it's very important to underscore the importance of sitting down and saying, okay, what are the issues here? What do we need to discuss? How do we form the dialogue with the community? How do we ensure that the community's health professionals are on side? Where's government? So on and so forth. Another big promise that Mr. Trudeau has made is to implement 94 recommendations released in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. However, the federal government cannot do this alone. Society and industry must also participate. The people here don't have to act on all 94 recommendations, but you do need to address the 93rd recommendations or call to action in the coming months. And I'm just going to read what that is. So go to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations released by Murray Sinclair in the Reconciliation Commission just months ago, back in May, and go to the 93rd recommendation, and it states this: we call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards of corporate policy in core operational activities involving Indigenous people and their lands and resources. This would include, but not limited to, the following. 1, commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. 2, to ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. And again, in this case here, we're talking about where can you focus on electrification of communities that currently don't have hydro in their communities. The third one, provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal and Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. Industry also has a duty to remind the federal and provincial governments that First Nations must be treated as equal partners in resource development. You must remind governments that First Nations signed treaties in the belief that they would be sharing in the wealth of the land and resources. For example, when the chiefs in northwestern Ontario signed Treaty 3 in 1874, they said they could feel the rustling of gold beneath their feet, which they assumed would be shared equally with the Crown. One of the treaty signatories, Chief Powassan, had a set of notes made for him during the negotiations. The notes state this: if some gold or silver mines be found in their reserves, it will be to the benefit of the Indians. But if the Indians find any gold or silver out of their reserves, they will surely be paid for the finding of mines. And again, if you think about this for a second, and I don't want to get into a long-winded history about the Indian Act. They created the Indian Act in 1876, which was essentially institutional racism. It's Canada's apartheid, but it was full control and authority over First Nation people. You know, at that point, the Indian Act forced our people to live on these small pieces of land, such as the apartheid system in South Africa. And in fact, let me give this to you. The apartheid system was built on the treaties in Ontario. South Africa's apartheid. And let me ask you to go and do your research on this if you've got a little bit of time. But essentially, in the pre-Confederate treaties, the Robinson treaties, where they set up the reserve systems or the lands that were to be set aside for our people exclusively, the Crown imposed and implemented the Indian Act system, which is a race-based segregation. Essentially, in the early 1900s, the British monarchy offered that to the South Africans as a model for segregation in apartheid in South Africa. So part of what formed the apartheid system in South Africa was the Indian Act system in this country. And isn't it an embarrassment that the Indian Act is still alive and well in this country? So just wanted to share that with you. However, the final treaty documents make no reference to sharing gold or any other resources. And a lot of gold, silver, potash, iron ore, diamonds, oil, natural gas, and the list goes on, has been found on Indian land over the last 150 years. It made Canada and Ontario very rich, and so too the investment community. Today, First Nations industry have been sharing some of the wealth. This has included awarded contracts to First Nations-owned businesses such as catering, transportation, security, and environmental monitoring. First Nations have also become involved in clean energy. Samsung and Six Nations have partnered on a $1 billion wind and solar farm in southern Ontario, near Ontario. Henvey Inlet is building a massive wind farm on the Georgian Bay that will feed power into thousands of homes in mainstream Ontario in the coming years. Just last month, I was at the official opening of the Bow Lake Wind Facility located 80 kilometers northwest of Sault Ste. Marie. I stated that the Bow Lake representatives represents the future path of First Nation partnerships and ownership in supplying clean energy to Ontario and North America. However, it would not have become a reality without the vision and leadership of the Batchewana First Nation and Nodin-Kinigan Limited Partnership and Blue Earth Renewables. I was very pleased to witness the successful completion of one of the largest First Nation-driven wind energy projects in Canada. While Bow Lake's 36 wind turbines will be supplying energy to the Ontario power grid for at least 20 years, I hope it will inspire hundreds to actually embark on similar partnerships. We need Bow Lakes of all sizes to supply energy to mining and other industries. At the same time, these projects will also electrify our own communities. We especially need smaller community grid systems in order to to, and once and for all, eliminate pollution and sickness that is being caused by diesel power. And again, I think that the moral starting point here on environmental issues and protection for First Nation communities, there seems to be a consistent opportunity here for industry and First Nations. There is no reason in this technological day and age that every single First Nation, no matter how remote, shouldn't be able to power their communities with wind and solar. In addition, every single First Nation should be able to own wind and solar operations that power Ontario and Canada now and into the future. In closing, I want to acknowledge the good work that has been done in First Nations by industry groups like the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada and the Ontario Mining Association. I look forward to more dialogue, especially with chiefs at the community level and in months to come. And again, we need your help to lobby the province and the federal government. Ontario has been working on a resource revenue sharing policy since 2007. Imagine if the policy had been in place 50 years ago. Imagine if resource revenue sharing was a reality 5 years ago when the Ring of Fire was ready to be the next big thing. Instead of beginning to generate billions in revenues today, the Ring of Fire is still on the economic back burner. Let's hope that the provincial win and the federal Trudeau governments can finally generate sparks in this enormous opportunity. We need to work together to generate prosperity for all. We need to once and for all eliminate the horrible social conditions that result in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and those children that take their lives and our elders. I do want to, in conclusion, underscore the issue of environmental jurisdiction, only to say that it's a major component that should not be undervalued as a critical piece in how decisions will be made into the future. In fact, our political accord with Ontario in August focuses on a new way forward with the province of Ontario. The Premier and Cabinet ultimately helping to create certainty on matters like jurisdiction. We all know that the land, air, water, and in this case, the little spark of molecular matter that forms electrons that form electricity are elements that matter to the survival of humanity. As First Nations, we will secure our rightful place. And of course, the political agenda of First Nations is a bigger discussion that I hope you embark on learning more about. The time to invest in our peoples in energy and mining projects is now. The dividends will provide security and prosperity for all of our children only if we are able to set out and achieve the social license together. Miigwech.